Alrighty, hello everybody. Let's take a look. This was a really interesting game. Let's take a look at this one real quick. I played this a little while ago, and now that I'm on a quick break, I've got a few minutes. I can quickly do a quick review of it. Queen Gambit, we end up transitioning into the Queen's Gambit declined line. I said this at the time that I made the move, in my head anyway, that this is an early pawn push, an early e3 pawn. I don't know if someone's going to eventually somehow punish me for this early pawn move. There's probably a better way to avoid this, but this is kind of the setup I've been going for lately. Get my knight out, get my other knight out. Now this is the counter. I called it at the time. I was talking out loud in my head or making notes. I called this a counter gambit, and I don't really know what you actually would call it. So the Queen's Gambit refused. Queen's Gambit declined. Yeah, I don't. This stayed as the martial defense, so it's the second most common response from this position. Well, either way, my opponent is now. Now this is not a gambit because this pawn is covered. My pawn is covered. In fact, my pawn is covered twice, 3 times actually. So I decided to leave things alone and just continue with my development plan. So just standard developing. If my opponent were to capture, I capture back. If my opponent captures the d4 pawn, then I can capture back. And I debated about this quite a bit, actually, at the time. Yeah, look at the clock here, 20. So when I saw this, I spent a little bit of time doing some calculating. So 9:49. So what's that? 23 seconds there just for that move, knowing that my opponent is probably going to capture one or the other. I already know what my plan is if they capture the c pawn. If they capture the d pawn, the question then becomes, how do we capture back? And then I spent from 9:26 to another 26, 27 seconds almost on that. So essentially, I spent almost a minute of my clock just trying to decide which way do I want to take back. The thought process here is this. If you take with the e-pawn, which is what I did, my opponent's eventually going to capture my c-pawn. And then when I capture back, I end up with what's known as an isolated queen's pawn. My queen pawn right here in the center of the board has no support. There are no pawns around it. It's all by himself. The question then becomes, does this become a target for my opponent? Do they start looking at ways that they can take advantage of this? Notice this pawn is basically making sure, that our queens aren't traded off. Neither one of us is castled, and neither of us have rooks defending our queen. So it is something we have to keep an eye on. But that was when my thought process was, do I want to end up with an isolated queen pawn, or do I take with the knight when my opponent captures here? I have 2 pawn islands. I have no C and D pawn. My opponent also has no C and D pawn. So that kind of mirroring effect. So that was what my thought process was going into it. Number one, I'm proud of myself for considering what the world looks like with an isolated queen pawn. I don't know the strategies dealing with an isolated queen pawn. All I know is that I have an isolated queen pawn. It's a single pawn in the center of the board, and it could become a target. So that was my thought process. After a minute of thinking, I still ended up just pushing the pawn. My final thought process was, if my opponent doesn't capture here, I'm left with 2 pawns in the center of the board, and I'm happy. My opponent has 2 pawns mostly in the center of the board as well. They're happy. So it feels like a pretty strong position for both of us. So I feel pretty good about it. My opponent pushes his h-pawn, probably going to castle kingside, right? Probably going to castle kingside. That's perfectly fine. Since I'm expecting a dark square bishop to end up trying to pin my knight, I go ahead and get my bishop, my dark square bishop, to d2 to defend the knight, so that way I don't have to mess up my pawns any more than necessary. If these pawns stay, then eventually I can push my b pawn, and I can have a little pawn chain here. At least that's my thought process. My opponent goes for the aggressive knight. How do we take back? If we immediately trade knights, my opponent now gets a position where their d pawn moves over to the e column, and it directly attacks my my knight. So I quickly stop that by putting an extra attacker on this square. So now I have 2 attackers on the knight. He only has 1 defender, So that makes me a little bit happier. My pawn underneath the queen is defended still by my knight, so I don't have to get rid of it anytime soon. The one thing that does leave open, though, and you can see I did spend another about 30 seconds considering this position as well. My dark square bishop is under attack. It's defended, right? It's actually defended twice, right? So my dark square bishop is defended twice, but it does mean giving up a bishop. So I can either move out of the way, let my opponent trade here, mess up my pawns, which is the whole reason I left that bishop there to begin with, or I can do what I did in the game, which was try to defend, add another attacker to the knight so that I can win material. My opponent then realizes they have to move forward, so they capture. I capture back with the queen. I'm now ready to castle. Technically, I could castle either side, but when we look at the board now, my opponent is not at all developed. If we quickly glance back at their moves, pawn, knight, pawn, 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 knight, the same knight, the same knight. So that same knight made 3 moves, and they made a lot of pawn moves. And in that time, I was able to get developed. So I don't feel so bad losing that bishop because of my advanced development compared to my opponent's development. So I feel pretty good, even though I've given up a bishop. So I'm going to quickly turn on the engine. Notice I have not looked at the engine at all so far. And the engine says, yeah, it's a pretty even position. White has a very, very small advantage. I'm going to let it finish calculating here. But white has a very small advantage. Not much. Nothing to write home about. So engine-wise, we are about even. So both players should be happy in this position. We're both even. But I like the fact that I'm developed. I quickly castle. I'm 100% developed now. Everything's honky-dory. So now my opponent makes another slightly questionable move. Knights to the edge are kind of dead. Knights on the wing are a useless thing. Whereas, I mean, this knight could have happily come over here to the c6 square. I don't know where my opponent plans on remaneuvering. Plans on remaneuvering. There is a b4 square available, which does put pressure on my other bishop. So maybe that's my opponent's plan, is, you know what, he's going to go aggressive to trade away his knights for my bishops. But there's an easy way to stop that. a3. Now, my opponent can't go there, can either go home or can go to c7. So that's it. My opponent can go to c7. So maybe this was a good move, maybe it was a bad move, I don't know. I would have developed through the c6 square first. That puts an extra attacker on the d4 pawn. It also keeps your knight in the center of the board. But either way, my opponent decided to continue development that way. The b7 pawn is not a target yet, but I am keeping that in the back of my mind that should something happen, I can always push past or capture and then expose his knight, trade my bishop for his knight, and leave this, basically shift his b pawn to an undefended a pawn. So that's something else I'm looking at in the back. It's just in the back of my mind, but that's only if the light square bishop moves. My opponent castle is finally getting developed. Now I have a nice outpost. Now my opponent can chase it away, but I feel pretty good that I have this knight outpost. My opponent would have to move their f pawn. Yep, very solid moves here by my opponent. And this is where I decided to try to get a little crafty, right? Like, I'm not saying we all know, look, we all know I am not good at chess. I am not great. Every now and then, though, I come up with an idea. So, this is my idea. Are you ready? My opponent's bishop is defended. Defended twice. And he is looking to attack my queen. I kind of want my queen to stick around so I can get it remaneuvered onto this long diagonal here, right? Because if I could get my queen and bishop along this diagonal, that makes a great battery for me. That would be really nice. So what if we start chasing the bishop around? Yes, I have moved my f pawn, my forget about it pawn. But I do have a little bit of pressure already on my opponent's f7 square. My rook, if I lose this pawn, if I lose my f pawn, my rook becomes another threat along that f7 pawn. My bishop could end up, possibly, on the g6 square, and this pawn might be trapped or pinned or something along those lines. So there's a lot of things I'm considering right now, but essentially looking at the E, F, and G ranks as I'm basically attacking them pretty hard right now, right? My opponent drops back. Now, the question is this a trade that I'm willing to take? And yeah, I've already said that I'm willing to get my rook open on the F file. So if my opponent trades here, I'm okay with that trade. So I decided to get my queen involved. Now, I don't know if this is the correct square for the queen. The queen and the rook do make a battery, but notice my opponent already has some strong defense on here. So I have 1, 2, 3 attackers. If everything goes perfectly as planned, I have 3 attackers on the F pawn. My opponent only has 2 defenders, but one of those attackers is my queen. And would I be happy giving away my queen in order to trade for a pawn and a rook? Probably not. But that was my thought process, was just getting some pressure up here. I didn't know where else to go. I didn't know, where else the queen would go. Maybe if I get my queen over here to the G file, I can pin the G pawn. And if I pin the G pawn, then maybe I could somehow walk. I don't really have anything else that could get there. I don't really have a lot, so it would be a while. But that was my thought process. Well, you know what? There's pressure along here. Let's continue the pressure. At this point in time, my opponent finally captured the pawn. My C pawn, I capture back with the bishop, like planned. I'm already established that I am capturing towards the center. My F pawn is moving out of the way, so I have opened up. I now have a semi-open F file, and my opponent rightfully starts piling up defense. I start, at this point in time, looking to see if there's any sacrifices I can make. Nope, he's got this overly defended, so really sacrificing down here is not quite the answer. Yes, his 2 rooks are not connected, but his queen is doing a really good job combined with the king. The 2 of them are defending nicely, so really a sacrifice along the E file is not really a good sacrifice. Plus, if we look at it, my opponent's got this thing covered in multiple ways. So I start looking for other ways to start sacrificing. If I could get, is there some kind of interesting sacrifice that could cause me to open up my opponent's kingside even more? I don't really find anything. So now the plan is, let's just continue the pawn storm. My opponent has a light square bishop left, so my pawns are now on light squares. My king can hide on a light square. That's kind of what I'm thinking. I would like to reroute my bishop, again, back to this long diagonal. My opponent rightfully defends his b pawns. That means he's going to be getting his bishop out soon. Sure enough, there it is. Boom. So he defended the b pawn, and then the bishop comes out. Now the bishop's out. So now I'm thinking, do I trade? Is this the time to trade? No. No, it's not, because I need this bishop because it puts serious threat along that long diagonal. So now I am looking for d3 or e4 to park my queen along the same diagonal as my bishop to put that pressure. My opponent rightfully pressures my queen, but I had another plan anyway. So this comes with tempo. Now my opponent has to defend, and here's a solid defense. Very, very solid defense. Now we start trying to figure out how do we bust this open? My opponent has some serious heavy hitters defending, but what if we try this sacrifice? Right? So the only thing that's really defending the g6 pawn is the f7 pawn. Now, my first thought was, what if I just take it? Well, that doesn't work because my opponent can then take with the queen, and that keeps the g6 pawn defended. So I throw my rook up here thinking that I'm going to sacrifice my rook along the g file. So if I capture on g6, my opponent captures back with the f pawn, right? Because this comes with check. My opponent captures back with the f pawn, and then I can capture back with my queen, putting the king in check. at which point in time my opponent could probably defend with their queen, almost force a queen trade, because then even queen, at this point it'd be queen to h7, even that could be met with captures, and my opponent captures back and they go up material. So this is the thought process I'm having, is that I'd like to make this sacrifice possibly. My opponent doubles up. So they add another defender up here to the g6 square. So this is, my opponent's playing very, very, very solidly. I just happen to have lined up with a pretty aggressive attack on the king side. So I go for the double up. When in doubt, double up rooks. Now my opponent has successfully defended their f7 pawn and their g6 pawn. The problem is, and it's the same problem they've had this whole time, is if this queen were to end up on h7, that's also checkmate, because my opponent has nothing that can defend and can't move anywhere. So, yes, this is helping, but there are some concerns. And so at this point in time, I start the, we're in full-on attack mode. My opponent tries to defend, but we're in full attack mode. I'm exposing my king. I'm using my kingside pawns. This is a very aggressive, this is not normally my playstyle. I'm not normally this aggressive. But I said, you know what the hell, right? We're having fun. We're enjoying it. We're going for it. So now my opponent can take, and I'm going to push past. And yes, they will have a passed pawn. But you know what? If I have to get over there, I can. I'm kind of safe. I'm kind of allowing them to have a passed pawn. And if I have to push up and over, I can. My opponent gets a rook over to the semi-open file, and I'm not 100% certain what this is trying to do. Maybe he's thinking that he has to sacrifice the exchange here in order to get my queen off of the strong diagonal. I don't know. Maybe he's looking to double up here somehow. I'm not certain. But now things are really starting to fall apart for my opponent. King is fully exposed. My opponent spends a long time thinking here. Another 30 seconds. Yeah, about 30 seconds trying to decide what to do. And I think this is at which point in time they conceded the game. There's really not a lot left they could do. Maybe they were worried that I would be able to target one of their pawns somehow. I don't know. Oops, if I can get my arrow straight. I don't know. But I've got a couple of options here. Number one, I can just continue to push this pawn. But I decided to go capture on this instance, basically opening up this long diagonal. So there's really nothing my opponent can do. At this point in time, in fact, let's look at the engine. Yeah. The engine says right now I'm in a massive advantage. And from there it becomes a forced checkmate. Capturing on G, capturing the F pawn is the correct move order. My opponent really can't do anything. I mean, the best they could hope for is maybe. But I guess then I've got this, don't I? Yeah, I'm not quite certain. Either way, at the end of that, we're even in material, but my opponent's way exposed. So I'm not certain how they would defend against that. It would be difficult. But either way, my opponent captured back. But this is what I was going for here. This nice long fat diagonal becomes checkmate. So this was a very aggressive game by me. This is not normally my play style, but I really enjoyed it. I can't say that I'm always going to do it. In this case, it worked out. I did lose the early bishop pair. This knight ended up becoming kind of a dud for my opponent, sadly. And it was basically right here at this point that my opponent. Let's see what the engine says. Yeah, the engine says that that's not a great move for my opponent, and the engine wants me to push the f pawn. I'll be darned. This is not something I would normally do. Normally, I would just move my queen out of the way, right? But you know what? It's turned into a nice attacking opportunity. Not something I would normally do. But now we've got, pawns in the center of the board, controlling the center of the board. I've got threats along the f file. And my opponent had to remaneuver their knight. And yeah, I had to move my knight out of the way too, my bishop out of the way too. But that was the plan. The plan was to get it back to this diagonal. And I thought that just bringing it back, right? So I wasted a move instead of just bringing it straight back. The idea was I didn't know where my queen was going to go, and I didn't want it to be too obvious. But at our rating level and in the late high 1300s, low 14s, like people aren't going to be surprised anymore. I'm the only idiot that gets surprised by this kind of stuff. Wow, the engine really says that this has become back into an even game again. Yeah, and that's where it turned. See, I figured it turned pretty much right here when my opponent allowed me to get my rook infiltrate. The engine says it's not a great move. Yeah, this is the next thought, was just pin this pawn. Yeah, it wouldn't really be... Ooh, excuse me. Yeah, and this is where things really start to fall apart for my opponent, unfortunately. It really opens up here, and it just... I was proud of this exchange, this plan. I mean, this plan worked. Finally, right? Finally, one of my plans actually worked. Either way, it was a fun game. Started out with the Queen's Gambit declined line. Pretty standard stuff early on. This is a move order I'm not familiar with, but you know what? I feel like the way it went in this particular game, I wasn't that worried about it, so I'm okay with it. It ended up all right for me. It does expose my king a little bit, so I do have to be cautious there. Yeah. I feel like this game was fun. It was a lot of fun to play. And yes, I ended up on the winning side, so of course it's more fun to win. But this was a fun game because I feel like I understood how the game was developing and I could see how the game was developing. Like, way back over here, like predicting that my opponent's going to develop their bishop immediately. Like, I felt good that I said, hey, you know what? He's protecting his pawn because he wants to get his bishop out. Like, I saw that and boom, my opponent did it. Like, these kind of things, seeing that made me feel really good. Now, I can't predict everything, but little things like that I was able to see. So it felt good. Alrighty, guys, I gotta get back to work. I will catch you guys next time. Later.